I don't know when exactly things started to go wrong. Maybe it was before I even set foot on the trail. Maybe it was the moment I ignored that uneasy feeling in my gut, the quiet warning at the back of my mind telling me to turn around. But I didn't. I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo, 3-day hike through a stretch of remote wilderness in Montana. A challenge, but nothing beyond my experience. I had done longer hikes, harder ones. I had planned carefully, packed all the right gear, checked the weather. Everything should have gone smoothly. Didn't. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise. There were no other cars, which wasn't surprising. This trail wasn't popular. That was part of the appeal. I cut through dense forest, then climbed into rocky hills before looping back toward the river valley. I shouldered my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was cool, the forest quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding between towering pines. I settled into a rhythm, my boots crunching over damp earth, the weight of my pack familiar on my shoulders. I made good time, covering nearly 10 miles before stopping for lunch near a small creek. I felt good, but that quiet warning in my gut never went away. By late afternoon, I reached the base of the hills. The trees thinned out here, giving way to rocky slopes and tall, dry grass. I picked a flat spot near a boulder and set up camp. I cooked a quick meal, stretched out my legs, and watched the sun dip below the trees. The sky turned soft shades of orange and pink. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it, just a wrongness in the air. I brushed it off as nerves. I was alone, miles from anyone. My brain was playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and told myself everything was fine. I fell asleep fast. I woke up even faster. The first night, the whistling. A sound pulled me from sleep. Soft, subtle, whistling. Not the wind, not an animal, person. A slow, quiet whistle, drifting through the trees. I held my breath. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere down the slope, hidden in the darkness. I checked my watch. 2:43 a.m. I listened, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whistling continued for a few minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. I lay there, staring at the roof of my tent, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep again. Day 2. Something is wrong. I told myself I imagined it. That morning, I packed up, tightened my boots, and kept moving. The trail got steeper, winding through rocky outcrops. The air was thinner up here, the sun hotter. I tried to focus on the hike, on my footing, on my breathing, but the feeling wouldn't leave, that sense of being watched. By midday, I reached the highest point of the trail, a flat ridge with a view of endless forest below. I sat down, ate a protein bar, and let myself relax for a moment. Then I saw them. Far below, near the tree line, 2 figures, standing still, too far to make out any details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. A jolt of fear shot through me. Hikers? Hunters? Something else? I stared for a long time, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I stood, adjusted my pack, and started down the other side of the ridge. I forced myself not to look back. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was low. I found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. I tried to eat, but my stomach was tight. Something was wrong. I crawled into my tent early, knife within reach. I didn't expect to sleep. I was right. The second night, the footsteps. The sound came just after midnight. Not whistling this time. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps were soft, careful. Like someone trying not to wake me. They stopped near my head. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. Then nothing. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Day 3, the descent. I packed up at first light, moving fast. My whole body felt tight with tension, like a wire pulled too hard. I had to get back to the truck. The trail twisted through dense forest now, thick with undergrowth. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder. Nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. By late afternoon, I was 5 miles from the trailhead. Then I saw it. Footprints. On the trail ahead of me, bare feet, deep in the mud. They hadn't been there before. My mouth went dry. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding. The trees pressed in on either side, the shadows stretching long. Then, just as I rounded a bend, a figure, standing in the middle of the trail, not moving, not speaking, just standing there, watching me. The sinking sun was behind them, casting their face in shadow. I stopped cold. My brain screamed run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, they took a step forward. Something in me snapped. I love hiking. I love the quiet of it, the escape from people, from work, from the never-ending noise of daily life. Out in the wilderness, nothing matters except putting one foot in front of the other, listening to the rhythm of your own breath, feeling the ground beneath you. I've hiked all over the country, short day trips, multi-day excursions deep into national parks. I take pride in knowing how to navigate, how to handle myself in the wild. I'm careful. I prepare. That's why what happened to me still doesn't make sense. And it's why I'll never hike alone again. This trip was supposed to be a challenge. A 4-day solo trek through a remote section of the Rockies. The trail wasn't well traveled. Exactly how I liked it. No tourists, no crowds, just me, my gear, and the mountains. I planned everything. I had my map, my GPS, a compass, extra food, a water filter, and a satellite emergency beacon. No cell service out there, but that was expected. I told my brother my route and when I'd be back. The first day was perfect. I started early, following the trail as it climbed through thick forest, the morning air crisp. The leaves had started to turn, the golds and reds painting the landscape. I made good time, stopping now and then to check my map. Everything was exactly as it should be. By late afternoon, I reached my first planned campsite, an open clearing near a small lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky. No signs of anyone else. Perfect. I set up my tent, filtered water, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dropped, the forest came alive with the sounds of night, crickets, the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. Normal sounds. I felt safe. I slept well. The second day was tougher. The trail climbed higher, winding through rocky terrain. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged cliffs and steep drop-offs. Mid-morning, I saw something odd. A boot print. Not mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone else was out here. I hadn't seen any cars at the trailhead. No signs of people on my route. But I wasn't completely alone. It didn't bother me at first. Other people hiked these trails. It was public land. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder more than usual. By late afternoon, I reached my next planned stop, a narrow ridge with a view stretching for miles. I set up camp, ate, and watched the sunset. The wind picked up that night, a steady, low howl through the trees. I woke up once, just after midnight. Something had snapped a branch nearby. I held my breath, listening. The wind, the creak of trees shifting. Nothing else. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. I went back to sleep. The third day, things started to feel off. I left early, pushing forward. The trail narrowed, twisting through dense forest. The air was still heavy. Then I saw it. Another boot print. This time it was different. It wasn't just one. There were two, side by side, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds. I picked up my pace. By noon, I was deep into the wilderness, far from anything or anyone. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, rot. The sharp, unmistakable scent of decay. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but it got stronger. Then I saw it. Off the trail, maybe 20 feet into the trees. A deer carcass, or what was left of one. It was torn open, ribs exposed, the meat stripped in ragged chunks. I've seen predator kills before. This was different, messy, violent, and fresh. Flies buzzed thick in the air. The blood was still wet. Something had killed it recently, and that meant whatever did it was still close. I backed away slowly, forcing myself to breathe. Then I saw the footprints, leading away from the body. Human. My mouth went dry. Who the hell was out here? And why were they walking away from a freshly killed deer? I didn't want to know. I turned and walked fast, almost jogging. My pack felt heavier. The trees pressed in tighter. I needed to get to my next camp before dark. I made it just before sunset, a small clearing near a rock overhang. I didn't eat. I didn't start a fire. I just sat in my tent, listening. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just silence. At some point, I fell asleep. I don't know what woke me, but when I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, thick, heavy. I listened. Then, a sound. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps. Not an animal. Human. Moving just outside my tent. My chest tightened. My breath came shallow. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my fingers ached. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft, shuffling sound, like something being dragged through the leaves. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body locked. Minutes passed, an hour, maybe more. Eventually, the sounds faded, but I didn't sleep again. I broke camp before sunrise. Didn't eat, didn't rest, just moved. My last day, 15 miles to the trailhead. I could do it. I just had to keep moving. By mid-morning, I felt better. The forest was waking up again. Birds, wind, normal sounds. Maybe I had imagined it. Then I saw something ahead. I stopped. A backpack, old, torn, lying in the middle of the trail. I stepped closer. The zipper was open, empty, like someone had picked it clean. I looked around. The trees stood silent. Then I saw them, the footprints, leading away from the pack, leading into the trees, and next to them, drag marks, long, deep. Something heavy had been pulled off the trail. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, not for water, not for anything. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed. Then, the parking lot, my car. I fumbled my keys, hands shaking. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe until I was miles away. I reported it. The deer, the footprints, the backpack. Park rangers went out. They found nothing. No carcass, no pack, no tracks, nothing. Like it never happened. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know someone else was out there. I don't hike alone anymore. Hiking has always been my escape. Something about being alone in the woods, away from the noise of everyday life, makes me feel free. The quiet, the fresh air, the sense of moving forward with nothing but my own strength. It's all I ever needed. But nature doesn't care about you. And sometimes, being alone is the worst thing you can be. This happened last fall. I had taken a few days off work and decided to do a 3-day solo hike through a remote section of a national park. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was different. The trail was far less traveled, a mix of rugged mountain paths and deep forest. The perfect challenge. I packed everything carefully: extra food, a full water bladder, a first aid kit, a compass, and a GPS. My phone had no service out there, but I had a satellite emergency beacon just in case. I told a friend my route and when I'd be back. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear. The trail climbed steadily through dense trees, opening up now and then to breathtaking views of the valley below. I made good time, covering nearly 10 miles before setting up camp near a small stream. I ate, stretched, and sat by the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest buzzed with the sounds of night, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of unseen animals moving through the brush. I slept deeply. The second day started well, too. I moved deeper into the forest, the trail narrowing, twisting between thick trees. The farther I went, the quieter it got. Less birdsong, less wind, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves. Around noon, I noticed something odd. The trail had fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were deep, wide, someone much bigger than me. But what struck me was that they weren't coming from ahead. They were coming from behind. Someone else was out here, moving in the same direction as me. I kept walking, shaking it off. It was a public park. Other hikers used these trails, even if they were remote. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few hours later, I came across something else. A campsite, or what was left of one. A small clearing just off the trail. The remnants of a fire pit surrounded by flattened grass where a tent had been. But there was no gear, no backpack, no tent poles, nothing. Just a pile of clothes. They were dirty, torn in places. A pair of hiking boots sat nearby, one of them missing a shoelace. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or hadn't come back. I felt uneasy. The footprints, the abandoned camp, something was off. But I told myself to keep going. I was on a tight schedule. If I pushed on, I'd reach my next campsite before dark. So I did, but the feeling didn't go away. By the time I reached my planned stop, a small clearing near a ridge, it was nearly dusk. I set up my tent quickly, ate a protein bar, and sat by my small fire, watching the trees. I listened. Nothing. Then a sound. A soft rustling, somewhere just beyond the firelight. I turned my head, straining my ears. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon, the wind. But it didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. Then silence. I barely slept that night. Morning came cold and gray. I packed quickly and got moving, determined to shake the uneasy feeling crawling under my skin. But an hour later, I found something that made my blood run cold. Another footprint. This one was fresh, and it wasn't heading in the same direction anymore. It was coming from the side, out of the trees, and it stopped right in the middle of the trail, facing mine, like someone had stood there watching me pass. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wasn't alone. Someone else was out here off the trail, tracking me. I walked faster. Then I noticed something else. The forest was silent again. No birds, no wind, nothing. And then the smell. Something rotten, something dead. It hit me like a wall. A thick, choking stench, like meat left in the sun for too long. I covered my nose, scanning the woods. Flies buzzed nearby, drawn to something hidden in the brush. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped off the trail, pushing through the bushes. And there it was, a deer carcass. But it wasn't just dead, it was ripped apart. Its ribs jutted out, the flesh torn in jagged strips. Its head was twisted unnaturally, like something had snapped its neck. I've seen predators kill before. This wasn't that. This wasn't clean. It was brutal. And then I saw the footprints, leading away from the body. Human footprints. My stomach dropped. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to get out of there. I turned, practically running back to the trail. And that's when I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking. Close. Too close. I didn't think. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, not caring about the trail, not checking my map. Just moving, my breath ragged, my legs burning. I didn't stop. Not until I saw it. A cabin. It was small, weathered, the wood dark with age. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. Someone was there. I didn't think twice. I sprinted to the door, slammed my fist against it. It swung open. The inside was dark, cold. The fire in the hearth was just embers. The place looked abandoned. But then, on the far wall, scratched into the wood, "Don't look behind you." I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the open door, the empty woods. I didn't stay. I ran. I ran until I hit a dirt road, until I saw a car, until I was safe. I never went back. But sometimes when I hike alone, I get that feeling again. That prickle on the back of my neck. That sense that someone is watching. And I keep moving. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the silence of the woods, the rhythm of my steps on dirt trails, and the fresh air that makes me feel more alive than anything else. But I've also learned that nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you live or die. That's a lesson I'll never forget. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike, a 2-day trip through a remote mountain trail. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, and I was prepared. I had my backpack loaded with food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a map, and a compass. My phone had no service out there, but I had a GPS device just in case. The trail was deep in the woods, far from any towns. It wasn't a well-known path, which is why I picked it. I liked the solitude, the challenge of navigating unfamiliar terrain. The first few hours were perfect. Just me, the towering trees, and the crunch of leaves under my boots. The trail sloped upward, leading me deeper into the mountains. The air got thinner, cooler. Birds chirped in the distance, and occasionally, I heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then to check my map. Everything was going smoothly. That changed around midday. I was following the trail when I came to a fork that wasn't on my map. One path continued straight, just as the map indicated, but another, fainter trail veered off to the right. It looked old, overgrown, like it hadn't been used in years. Normally, I wouldn't have paid it any attention, but something about it caught my eye. The ground was disturbed. There were deep footprints in the dirt, fresher than anything else around. Someone had gone this way recently. Curiosity got the best of me. I stepped off my planned route and followed the footprints. The path was narrow, the trees pressing in on both sides. The farther I went, the darker it got as the canopy thickened overhead. It was unsettling, but I kept going. About 20 minutes in, I found something strange. A torn backpack, half buried under dead leaves. I crouched down, brushing dirt off the fabric. It was faded, old. When I pulled it open, I found rotting clothes, a rusted knife, and an empty water bottle. It looked like it had been there for years. That's when I felt it, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I stood up quickly, scanning the woods. Everything was still, too still. The birds had stopped singing. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I told myself I was overreacting. The bag was probably abandoned by some hiker years ago. I decided to turn back and get back on the main trail. But when I started walking, I realized something. The path was gone. I spun in circles, searching for the way I had come, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, dirt. No footprints, no signs of my path. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I had a GPS, a compass. I could find my way back. I pulled out my GPS. No signal. I took out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings, but something wasn't right. The terrain didn't match up. I was lost. I told myself to stay logical. I had enough food and water to last at least a day. If I kept moving downhill, I'd eventually hit a stream or another trail. That was my plan. I started walking. Hours passed. The trees never changed. I was moving, but it felt like I was going in circles. I checked my compass again, but now the needle spun erratically, refusing to settle. I tapped it, shook it, but it was useless. Dusk was creeping in. The shadows stretched longer, the light fading to a dim orange glow. I needed to find shelter before nightfall. That's when I smelled it. Rot. Something nearby was dead. The stench was thick, sour. It made my stomach twist. I didn't want to find the source, but I had to know what was out there. I followed the smell, pushing through dense underbrush, and then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of it. His body was torn apart, ribs sticking out like jagged knives. The meat was fresh, still glistening. Something had killed it recently, and that meant whatever did it was still nearby. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. Every nerve in my body was screaming. I needed to get out of there. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the quick, uneven steps of a deer or a bear. These were slow, deliberate, heavy. I turned my head, scanning the trees. Nothing, but the sound was closer now. Crunch. I took a step back. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Crunch. It was behind me. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just ran as fast as I could, dodging trees, jumping over roots. The footsteps behind me quickened. I didn't stop until I tripped. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, my hands scraping against the dirt. I looked up, gasping for breath. Silence. No footsteps. No movement. Just the darkening forest. I didn't sleep that night. I found a spot between two rocks and stayed there, my back against the stone, clutching my knife. I listened. I waited, but nothing came. Morning came slow. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I had to keep moving. I walked for hours, exhaustion creeping into my bones. My water was running low. My food too. Then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw it. A road. A dirt road winding through the trees. I stumbled toward it, nearly crying from relief. And then I saw something else. A cabin. It was small, old, the wood rotting in places. There were no cars, no signs of people. But there was smoke curling from the chimney. Someone was there. I hesitated. Something about it felt off. But I was desperate. I needed water. I stepped onto the porch, raised a hand, and knocked. The door creaked open. No one was there. The inside was dark, cluttered. Old furniture, dusty shelves. The smell of burning wood filled the air. A fire crackled in the fireplace. Someone had been here recently. I turned to leave. Then I saw it. On the far wall, pinned with a rusted knife, was a photograph. A photograph of me, taken from behind. Taken that day. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I found a real road, until I flagged down a car, until I was safe. I never went back. I don't know who was in those woods. I don't know who took that picture. And I don't want to know. All I know is that I wasn't alone. Hiking alone had never scared me. I'd been doing solo hikes for years, covering dozens of trails across the country. I wasn't reckless. I always packed smart, told someone where I was going, and made sure I was well prepared for emergencies. This time was no different. I had planned a 3-day solo hike in the mountains of northern Montana. The trail was lightly traveled, far from any major towns, and promised amazing views along a winding ridge. It wasn't extremely difficult, but it was remote, which was part of the appeal. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m. My truck was the only vehicle in the small dirt parking area. I wasn't surprised. It was mid-September, off-season, and the forecast called for cold nights. I checked my pack one last time. Map, compass, GPS, fully charged. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, knife, bear spray, emergency whistle. Everything was there. I double-knotted my boots, locked my truck, and started walking. The first few miles were peaceful. The air was crisp, the trail was clear, and the forest felt alive. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. I made good time, stopping once to refill my water at a small creek. Around noon, I reached a ridge overlook, where the trees thinned, revealing an endless sea of mountains. I sat on a flat boulder, eating a protein bar, enjoying the silence. That's when I saw it. A set of boot prints in the dirt, fresh, heading off the main trail. I frowned. According to my research, this area wasn't popular. The trail had been empty all morning. But what caught my attention wasn't just the prints. It was how they looked. They didn't move in a straight line. They wandered, cutting through bushes, doubling back in some places, like whoever made them wasn't following a path. Something about it bothered me, but I shook it off and kept moving. By late afternoon, I'd covered about 12 miles and found a good place to set up camp. A small clearing, flat ground, close to a water source. I pitched my one-person tent, got a small fire going, and cooked a dehydrated meal. The sun dipped below the tree line, the temperature dropping fast. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackling of my fire. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just normal nighttime silence. But the uneasy feeling in my gut stayed. I crawled into my tent and forced myself to sleep. I woke up before sunrise, packed my gear, and got moving. My goal was to loop back toward the trailhead, reaching my truck by the following afternoon. A few hours in, I came across another set of boot prints. The same ones, still fresh, still wandering off-trail. Something wasn't right. I checked my GPS. The signal flickered before cutting out completely. I wasn't worried yet. I had my map and compass. I adjusted my route and kept going. But then the trail disappeared. 1 minute I was on a clear dirt path. The next, I was pushing through dense undergrowth. No sign of the trail I had been following for miles. I pulled out my map, trying to get my bearings. Somewhere I had veered off course. I turned around to backtrack. That's when I saw them. The boot prints, right next to mine. Not ahead of me, behind me. Someone had been following me. Day 2, the shadow in the trees. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe I had missed another hiker earlier, and they were on the same route. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. I kept moving, trying to get back on track. The forest felt different now, darker, the trees pressing in closer, the air too still. Then I smelled it, rot, like decay, thick and sour. It came in waves, carried by a wind that shouldn't exist in the motionless forest. I scanned my surroundings, heart hammering. That's when I saw it. Something standing between the trees. Not an animal, not a person, just a shape, tall, motionless, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I walked fast, almost jogging, cutting through the trees at an angle. I needed to find the trail again. After an hour, I spotted something through the trees. A structure, a small wooden cabin, old and half hidden by the thick forest. I hesitated. It wasn't on my map, but I needed help. Maybe there was a ranger cabin out here or an emergency shelter. I stepped closer. The door was slightly open. I pushed it wider. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and that same rotting smell. Then I saw them. Photographs. Dozens of them tacked onto the walls. Hikers. Some were old, black and white. Some were recent. Then I saw one that made my blood run cold. A photo of me, taken yesterday. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Outside. Getting closer. I turned and ran. I don't remember how long I ran. I just knew I had to get away. At some point, I hit a dry riverbed, followed it for miles until I saw something that felt like a miracle. A road, an old dirt road, cutting through the trees. I followed it, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. Then, in the distance, a truck. I stumbled toward it, waving my arms. The driver, a middle-aged man, stared at me like he knew, like he'd seen this before. "You came out the wrong way," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I just got in. I never found that cabin again. I never found out who had been following me. But when I got home, I checked my gear. Stuffed into the bottom of my pack was a single photograph. A photo of me taken from the tree line. Hiking had always been my escape. It was my way of getting away from everything. Work, people, the endless noise of life. There was something about being alone in the wild that made me feel at peace. No distractions, no stress. Just me, the trees, and the open trail. I had done solo hikes plenty of times before. I wasn't an amateur. I had the right gear, the right skills, and the right mindset. I always told someone where I was going, packed more supplies than I needed, and stayed aware of my surroundings. This time was no different. The plan was simple. A 3-day solo hike through a remote section of national forest in Wyoming. A loop trail, about 25 miles total, that would take me through dense forest, across a river, and up into some higher elevation before circling back to the trailhead. It wasn't a well-traveled area, but that's what I wanted. I arrived at the trailhead around 11 a.m. on a Friday morning. The air was crisp, the sky clear, perfect hiking conditions. I checked my pack one last time: tent, sleeping bag, extra food, plenty of water, a knife, a map, a compass, and my GPS. Everything was there. My truck was the only vehicle in the dirt parking lot, which wasn't surprising. This wasn't a popular hike. I locked up, adjusted my pack, and set off. The first few miles were easy. The trail was well marked, cutting through thick pine trees, the smell of sap and damp earth filling the air. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then for water. No signs of other people, just how I liked it. By mid-afternoon, I reached the first major landmark, a small wooden bridge over a narrow river. The water was clear, rushing over smooth rocks, reflecting the sunlight in shifting patterns. I took a quick break, sitting on a flat boulder, eating a protein bar while listening to the sound of the current. I checked my map. Everything was on track. I had another 6 or 7 miles before I'd set up camp. I kept moving. As the sun started dipping lower, the trail got narrower. The trees pressed in closer, the air colder. The peaceful feeling I had earlier started to fade, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no sounds of small animals scurrying through the underbrush, just my own footsteps. I ignored it and pressed on. By 6 p.m., I found a decent spot to camp, a small clearing off the trail, surrounded by tall trees. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and ate a quick meal. The silence still felt wrong, but I chalked it up to my own overactive mind. I forced myself to relax, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I slept lightly, waking up every couple of hours to listen. Nothing, just the same oppressive silence. By dawn, I was up, packed, and moving again. That's when things started getting weird. A few miles into the second day, the trail started to change. The dirt path became rockier, more uneven, the trees denser, the air colder. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A split in the trail. It wasn't on my map. I checked my GPS. The screen was frozen. I restarted it. Nothing. That wasn't great. But I still had my map and compass, so I wasn't completely lost. I looked at the two paths. The one on the left seemed more worn, with faint signs of old footprints. The one on the right looked barely traveled. Overgrown, narrow, vanishing into thick underbrush. I took the left path. It was a mistake. First, everything seemed fine. The trail was narrower than before, but still clear enough to follow. I walked for another couple of hours, expecting to hit my next waypoint soon. But then, I noticed something. The trees looked the same. Not just similar, exactly the same. Like I had been walking in a loop without realizing it. I stopped, checked my compass. The direction was off. I wasn't going the way I thought. I turned around to backtrack, but after an hour, I came across something I hadn't seen before. A cabin. It sat just off the trail, hidden between thick trees. Small, old. I hesitated. It didn't make sense. There wasn't supposed to be anything out here, no marked shelters, no ranger stations. The door was slightly open. I stepped closer. The air smelled wrong. Like old wood, damp earth, and something else I couldn't name appeared inside. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in photos. Photos of hikers, some old, some recent. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A photo of me, taken yesterday. I backed away, heart pounding. My breathing was too loud, too fast. I turned and started walking, fast, almost running. I needed to get out of here. I pushed through the trees, not caring about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Behind me, slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see. I picked up my pace. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air. The trees blurred past. The footsteps followed. Never closer, never farther, always just out of sight. Then I tripped. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my knee. I scrambled up, but in that split second, I saw something. Boot prints. Not mine. Fresh. I bolted. I don't know how long I ran. Everything blurred together. I just knew I had to keep moving. And then, through the trees, I saw a break in the forest. A road. I stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for air. A truck was parked just ahead, an old, beat-up pickup. I ran toward it. A man stood beside it. Middle-aged, weathered face, eyes narrowed. He looked at me like he knew. like he had seen this before. "You came out the wrong way," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I just asked how far I was from the trailhead. He told me, 30 miles. I never found that cabin again. I never figured out who or what was following me. But when I got home, I checked my gear. Stuffed into the bottom of my pack was a photo of me taken from the tree line. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being alone in the wild, far from the noise of the city, that feels peaceful. It's just you, the trees, the dirt under your boots, and the endless sky above. It was supposed to be just another solo trip, one I'd planned for weeks. The route was remote but manageable. A 2-day trek through dense forest with a return loop that would take me back to my truck. I packed everything I needed: a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food and water, a GPS, a map, a compass, and a good knife. I even told a friend my exact route just in case. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The air was crisp, and the trees swayed gently under a clear sky. I took a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a steady incline with patches of sunlight breaking through the trees. I made good time, stopping only for water breaks and to check my GPS. Everything was going smoothly. As the sun dipped lower, I found a clearing near a small stream and set up camp. The spot was perfect: soft ground, plenty of space, and the sound of running water nearby. After setting up my tent and gathering some dry wood, I made a small fire and cooked a quick meal. It was the kind of evening I lived for, just me and the quiet. I woke up early, packed my gear, and continued on. The trail became narrower, the trees denser. I checked my GPS often, making sure I was on track. By midday, I reached a ridge with an incredible view of the valley below. I sat there for a while, eating a protein bar and soaking in the silence. Then I heard it, a rustling in the distance. At first, I assumed it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bird moving through the underbrush, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the random crunch of twigs that animals usually make. It was steady, purposeful. I scanned the tree-line but saw nothing. The sound stopped. Shaking it off, I continued. An hour later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, following just out of sight. I stopped, heart pounding. I turned around, scanning the dense trees, but there was nothing there. I wasn't imagining it. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I wasn't a paranoid person, but something was wrong. I picked up my pace. The trail ahead was unfamiliar, even though my GPS said I was still on track. The terrain was getting rougher, the trees thicker. The air felt heavier. Then my GPS cut out. I tapped the screen, but it was frozen. I restarted it. Nothing, just a blank screen. I pulled out my map and compass. I knew how to navigate without technology, but the realization that I could no longer rely on my GPS made my pulse quicken. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost yet. I just had to keep moving. The footsteps returned. Closer. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to panic. Not yet. I adjusted my pack and started walking again. Faster this time. The woods felt different now. The trees loomed taller, the shadows darker. Every sound made me flinch. The steady crunch of something behind me never fully disappeared. Then, I saw something up ahead. A backpack. Old, torn, half buried under leaves. I hesitated before stepping closer. The zippers were broken, and the fabric was torn like something or someone had ripped it open. I crouched down, my hands shaking as I brushed away the dirt. Inside, there were scraps of clothing, a rusted knife, and a notebook. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with notes about the trail, just like something I would write. Then the handwriting changed, messier, frantic. Something is wrong. I'm not alone. I hear footsteps at night. I know someone is watching me. The last entry was barely legible. He's out there. He doesn't want me to leave. I dropped the notebook, my breath coming in short gasps. My brain tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe someone got lost here years ago. Maybe it was just some prank. But then I noticed something else. The footprints. Not mine. Not animal tracks. Human. Fresh. And they were heading toward me. A surge of adrenaline hit me, and I took off. I ran, crashing through branches, ignoring the sting of thorns cutting my arms. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs screamed. Then I saw it. A cabin. Small, old, barely standing. The door was slightly open. I had no choice. I bolted inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The inside was worse than I expected. A small cot, a rusted stove, and the smell of damp wood. But the worst part? The walls. They were covered in photos. All of hikers. Some recent, some old, some decades faded. All of them had been taken in the woods. Some had notes written beneath them. Dates. Names. A few had the word "gone" scrawled under them. I was shaking. I had to get out of here. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Right outside. I held my breath. The door creaked. A shadow passed by the window. I gripped my knife so tightly my fingers hurt. Then silence. I didn't move. Minutes passed. An hour. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting. When I finally got the courage to move, the sun was lower in the sky. I peeked outside. No one was there. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't care about the trail. I moved downhill, pushing through trees, scrambling over rocks, running until my legs gave out. And then, like a miracle, I saw it. The road. My truck. I didn't even stop to catch my breath. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there, dirt flying behind me. Only when I was miles away did I finally pull over, hands shaking. I looked in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A photo tucked under my windshield wiper. Picture of me, taken on the trail. Hiking had always been my escape. I'd done countless solo trips, and nothing felt better than the isolation of the deep woods. Away from people, cars, and endless noise. There was something about being alone in nature that made me feel free. I had been planning this hike for weeks. It wasn't anything crazy, just a 3-day solo trek through a remote forest area in Montana. The trail was lightly traveled, which was exactly what I wanted. I had my gear packed perfectly. A tent, a good sleeping bag, food, a knife, a GPS, a compass, and a printed map. I even told my brother my exact route, just as a precaution. I wasn't a beginner. I knew what I was doing. The first day went exactly as planned. I arrived at the trailhead around 11 a.m., parked my truck, and set off. The first stretch was beautiful. Tall pines stretching endlessly on both sides, the air crisp and clean. The trail was well defined, cutting through the thick forest with enough elevation to keep things interesting. The sun filtered through the trees, casting flickering patches of light on the ground. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time. I covered about 10 miles that day before finding a solid place to camp near a stream. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I wasn't nervous. I had done this so many times before. That night I slept soundly. But the second day, that's when everything went wrong. I woke up at dawn, packed up my gear, and checked my map. The next stretch of my hike would take me deeper into the forest before looping back toward the trailhead on the final day. I started walking, enjoying the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Around midday, I came to a fork in the trail. This wasn't on my map. I checked my GPS. Nothing. The screen had frozen. I restarted it, but it wouldn't load. That wasn't great, but I still had my compass and printed map, so I wasn't too concerned. I looked at the fork carefully. One path seemed more traveled, the dirt packed down by footprints. The other was narrow, overgrown, barely visible. I took the more traveled path. Big mistake. The first few miles were fine. The trail seemed normal, winding through dense forest. But after a while, I noticed something odd. There were no trail markers. No signs, no cairns, no signs of human maintenance. That was unusual for a mapped route. Then the footprints disappeared. The well-packed dirt had turned into loose soil. No prints, no tire tracks. It was like no one had walked here in years. I kept going, but an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. Around 3 p.m., I decided to check my position against the map. I couldn't find the trail I was on. I wasn't lost. Not yet, but I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I decided to backtrack. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, or at least I thought I was. After about an hour, I realized something was very wrong. The terrain didn't look the same. The trees were denser, the undergrowth thicker. The trail I had been walking on was gone. I stopped, my heart pounding. I took out my compass. The direction I had been walking in should have taken me back. Didn't. I was walking in the wrong direction. I turned around again and picked up my pace. The sun was starting to dip lower, and the air was cooling fast. The forest felt too quiet. No birds, no wind, just a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree with deep scratch marks. They were fresh, long, jagged lines carved into the bark, running vertically like something had clawed at it. I swallowed hard and kept moving. Then, another tree, more scratch marks, and then another. I wasn't just lost. I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. By the time the sun had almost disappeared, I knew I had to find shelter. I wasn't going to wander blindly in the dark. I found a small clearing and set up my tent, trying to keep calm. I built a small fire, not too big, just enough to keep warm. I ate a granola bar, but my stomach was too tight with fear to eat more. I listened. Nothing. No leaves rustling, no twigs snapping. Just dead silence. I forced myself to lay down. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Footsteps. Not an animal. Human footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife. My fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light. I strained my ears. The footsteps stopped. Then, something brushed against my tent. A hand? A stick? I didn't know. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. The moment the sun rose, I packed up and started walking. I didn't care about my planned route anymore. I just wanted out. I pushed through the thick underbrush, ignoring the scratches on my arms. I walked for hours. Then I saw something ahead. A cabin. Small, old, almost hidden in the trees. I hesitated, but I needed help. My GPS was dead, and I had no idea where I was. I stepped closer. The door was slightly open. I peeked inside. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in photographs. Hikers, some recent, some old, the edges curling. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A photo of me, taken yesterday. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out. Then, like a miracle, I stumbled onto a road. A dirt road, but a road. I followed it until I saw a parked truck. An old man stood beside it, staring at me like I was a ghost. I must have looked insane. Scratched up, covered in dirt, panting like an animal. I didn't care. I asked where the hell I was. He told me I was 30 miles from the nearest trailhead. I never figured out what happened. I never found that cabin again. But when I got home, I checked my gear. My knife was missing, and stuffed into the bottom of my backpack was a photo of me sleeping in my tent. I love hiking. I love the silence, the feeling of being away from everything. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my footsteps on the dirt, the rustling of the trees, and my own steady breathing. I've done dozens of solo hikes. I'm careful. I prepare. I always bring a map, a GPS, extra food, a water filter, and an emergency beacon. I never take unnecessary risks, but this hike was different, and I don't think I'll ever go alone again. I had planned a 4-day solo hike through a remote section of a national forest, the kind of place where you don't see another person for days. The perfect escape. I parked my car at the small dirt lot near the trailhead, checked my gear one last time, and started walking. The air was crisp, the sun high in the sky. The first few miles were easy, wide trails, gentle slopes, the kind of hiking that felt almost effortless. As the hours passed, I moved deeper into the forest. The trail narrowed, winding through thick trees. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to check my map and drink water. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite near a small stream. I set up my tent, filtered water, and ate a quick meal. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I didn't think anything of it. I slept well. The second day was tougher. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. By midday, I had to stop to catch my breath, leaning against a fallen log, drinking deeply from my water bottle. That's when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. A footprint, not mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Wide, heavy. Someone had passed through recently. That wasn't unusual. Other people hiked these trails, even if they weren't common. But the print wasn't on the main path. It was coming from the trees, like someone had been walking off trail. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter. Maybe another hiker who preferred to go off the beaten path. I kept moving. By the third day, things started to feel wrong. The trail was harder now, climbing through rocky terrain. The forest had changed darker, denser. The trees pressed in close, the air thick and still. And the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made your skin prickle. No birds, no rustling leaves, just nothing. That's when I saw it. A campsite, or what was left of one. Just off the trail, a flattened patch of grass where a tent had been. A cold fire pit, a few scattered pieces of trash, and a backpack. I stepped closer. It was torn open, not unzipped, ripped like someone had taken a knife to it. Clothes and gear spilled out, dirty and half-buried under leaves. No sign of the owner. I felt something tighten in my chest. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I forced myself to breathe. There was a simple explanation. Maybe a bear had found the camp, ripped through the bag looking for food. The hiker could have packed up and left, abandoning the damaged gear. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, dozens of them, leading away from the camp. Deep, heavy, some overlapping like the person had been pacing, or waiting. I swallowed hard and turned back to the trail. I needed to keep moving. I made camp early that evening, choosing a spot where I could see the trail clearly. I built a small fire, ate, and sat with my back against a rock, watching the trees. Something about the abandoned campsite had shaken me. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then, a sound, distant, a soft rustling, barely audible over the crackling fire. I tensed, gripping my knife. Then silence. I stared into the darkness, my ears straining. Nothing. I forced myself to relax, but I barely slept that night. I woke up early, exhausted. I packed fast, eager to get moving. 15 miles to the trailhead. I could do it in a day. I just had to keep walking. By midday, I was making good time. The trail sloped downward, the forest opening up slightly. I started to feel better, my unease fading with each mile. Then I saw it. A boot print, deep, fresh, and next to it, drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled through the dirt. My mouth went dry. I followed the marks with my eyes. They led off the trail, disappearing into the trees. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to see. But I stepped forward anyway, just a few feet. And then I saw it. Tarp. Old, dirty, partially buried under leaves. Something was underneath it. I don't know why I did it, but I reached down, my fingers trembling, and pulled the edge of the tarp back. And I saw the body. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. It was a man, or what was left of him. His skin was gray, his face slack. His clothes were torn, his arms covered in deep gashes, and his eyes were open, staring. I stumbled back onto the trail, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my legs burned. Not when my lungs screamed for air. I ran until I saw my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The engine roared to life. I tore out of that lot, speeding down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I reported it. The police hiked out, found the body. They never found whoever did it. No tracks, no evidence, just a dead man in the woods. I don't know if I was being followed. I don't know if it was a random killing or if he had seen something he wasn't supposed to. But I do know one thing. I'll never hike alone again.